Welcome back to Black Widow Fishing. I'm Bryce. Does the thought of using a bait caster strike fear into you, or have you tried using one to only create a tangled mess? If so, you're in the right place, because today I'm going to show you how to master the use of a bait caster. I will also let you know my top 3 recommended bait casters to get. Before you make the decision to learn to use a bait caster, you need to know why you'd want to ever use one. A majority of longtime anglers would say simply because they are better, or they only work for power fishing, or blah 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 blah. For me, there are 3 simple reasons why I prefer to use a bait caster. 1, I find them much easier to use and control than a spinning rod, obviously after learning how to use it. You may find going back to a spinning rod is much more difficult after learning and extensively using a bait caster. Having precision control over your cast gives you a great advantage when trying to get your bait into a tight spot. 2, using a bait caster is far faster than a spinning rod. Speed is important because fishing is all about the number of casts. The more casts you make, the higher percentage you have of landing a fish. Speed becomes even more important when you fish in a tournament. The final reason, their form factor makes them easier to hold and easier to store in a boat or in rod holders for a kayak. Does this mean that you need to learn how to use a bait caster? Absolutely not. Again, unlike most, I believe you can fish your entire life without ever learning to use a bait caster, but I do suggest you do learn to use one. For this lesson, it's important to know that I'm not going to get into how everything works internally or the exact names of each part. For one, most anglers don't need to know this info. 2, if you want to know this, it's in your manual. Plus, I recommend people unfamiliar with bait casters take them to be professionally cleaned so you don't jack them up. So let's get into learning how to master one. Bait casters and conventional reels are technically the same, but we'll be focusing on bait caster for freshwater game fish as compared to a conventional reel that you would find most on a bay or open water fishing boat. There are hundreds, if not thousands, of different bait casters that all look slightly different, but for the most part, they all work the same and have the same basic controls. A bait caster has a reel or handle that will normally feature a double grip. They do have single grips, but they're rare. They also feature a star drag system and some sort of braking system. Some of them have internal braking systems where you need to pop the bottom cover off to reveal the brakes on the inside. It's typically harder to see which ones are activated, but if you flip it upside down like this, they come up. The ones that are away from the spool are off. The ones that are down are on. In this particular reel, there's only one brake on and a tensioner knob. The first thing to learn about a bait caster is how to spool the line, as it's slightly different than a spinning rod. Once you're set up to load your line, you want to start by putting the line through the level wind. The level wind is responsible for moving back and forth as you reel to keep your line even across your spool. While not mandatory, I usually start mine by getting my level line to one side or the other. After placing the line through the level wind, you need to get the line around the spool. Nearly all bait casters feature at least one hole in the spool, but most have many holes. A lot of anglers have no idea why these holes are even in the spool, but believe it or not, they're there to assist you getting the line around the spool. So simply place the line into one of the holes and spin the handle a little until the spool makes one revolution. Now you need to secure the line to the spool, and you have 3 choices to do so. You can leave the line in the hole and just spool over it. 99% of the time, I do not use this approach, and I never even consider it on smaller spools. The second option, and the one that I prefer, is to take a piece of electrical tape or any other kind of tape that you have and put it over the end of the line. I've never had a problem with the fish running out my line or ripping it off. I have only one instance where I was constantly changing my baits and didn't pay much attention to how much line I had used before I had just bomb casted it and watched all my line fly out of my reel. But I'd say one time in 25 years of fishing is pretty good. The final option is to secure the line by tying it the traditional way. And just a simple overhand knot would work. But I find it very difficult to do sometimes, given the small spaces to work with. The next thing we're going to want to do is to set our brakes. This is an important step, and given that there are numerous types of braking systems, you want to make sure you know how to use the reel that you have. The first and most common is a dial on the opposite side of the handle. Sometimes it can feature numbers, dots, or nothing at all. But regardless of whatever type of label system it has, turning the dial clockwise tightens the brakes, and counterclockwise loosens the brakes. There are also internal braking systems, which must be accessed by removing the side cover. And you'll quickly be able to tell by looking at the bottom of the reel. There can also be a combination of both. The brakes control the rotation of the spool. More brake power means more resistance on the spool. This in turn means less rotation, which means less human braking power needed, which means shorter casting distance, but also means less bird's nest if you happen to mess up. I recommend anyone learning to use a baitcaster always start with the most braking and slowly let it up once you get comfortable with using them. I usually have my brake level set to 1 or just above off, and rarely go above 50%. The use of brakes apply to all baitcasters except a Shimano DC reel, which works with the same principle but is executed digitally with a chip. In this case, you set your brakes according to the type of line you're using, which can be found in the manual. Usually, once you find your braking percentage that works for you, you leave it alone and only make adjustments when the situation dictates, such as strong wind. The next step, and arguably the most important step, comes to the tensioner knob. You would be honestly surprised at how many anglers have no idea what this knob is for or how to use it. As an angler using a baitcaster, you need to become intimately familiar with the knob. You are probably wondering what is so important about this little knob. Truth be told, the tensioner knob is another braking system that controls the speed of the spool. The major difference between the tensioner knob and the braking system is that the tensioner knob provides finer braking control, which you adjust for each lure or bait you have on your line. All bait casters work the same way when it comes to the tensioner knob. The only difference comes, again, when using the DC reel. But this is only a different process in the way that you set the knob to the right tension. We will cover how to set the tension knob of a DC reel first. To properly set the tension, you're going to need a fully rigged setup. Taking our DC reel, we're going to place our finger on the spool and attempt to slide it back and forth. If you can feel the spool moving when we turn the knob, you need to tighten the tension. Be sure to do this in very small increments, and remember, clockwise is tighter and counterclockwise is looser. After turning the knob, we check again and repeat the same action until the spool no longer moves. Then we give it another tiny turn, loose. And I mean very tiny. Now your DC reel is set up and ready to go. Using a non-DC reel, the process is much different. Before beginning, I recommend tightening your tension so you don't cause a backlash trying to set the tension knob. We then hold our rod out in front of us and press the thumb bar to release the spool. If you followed my suggestion, then nothing should happen. Now take your free hand and slowly begin to loosen the tension knob. When you continue to loosen the knob, you will continue to loosen the knob until the bait starts to fall. Once it starts to fall, you're in the zone, but not quite done yet. But we take a moment to really start focusing on the task. We will continue to loosen the knob until the bait slowly drops and once it hits the ground. If your bait hits the ground and the line continues to come out, your knob is too loose. In either case, reel the line back up and test it again and verify you have it set correctly. I usually complete the verification twice after the initial set point. Now, this baitcaster is ready to use. As a caveat, unless you're near water or you like destroying baits, I recommend you use a weight as your bait for practice. The first rule of using a baitcaster is to never press the thumb bar without having your finger on the spool holding the line. Failure to do this will cause the spool to unwind and ultimately cause a bird's nest. The second rule I give people in learning to use a baitcaster is that side-on casts are infinitely easier than an overhead cast. So much so that I rarely ever use an overhead cast. So to begin to cast, we hold the line, press the thumb bar. Then we wind our cast up and throw the line forward, making sure we keep our fingers near the spool. When the line reaches its peak and begins to head towards the water or the ground, that's when we're going to press our finger down onto the top of the spool, stopping the line. Failure to do this will result in, you guessed it, another bird's nest. Now the reel operates just like a normal spinning reel. So I'll go over this one more time. Finger on the line, press the bar, cast, and stop the line as it starts to come down. You want to use the same technique with the DC, but a DC reel is more forgiving, and the majority of the braking is controlled by the digital chip. So technically, you could probably get away with not using your finger to stop the spool, but I wouldn't try it, and it would also build a bad habit. Now, practice this 25 times for 7 days a week, and I guarantee you'll be well on your way to mastering the use of a baitcaster. Now, you're probably wondering which baitcaster you should get. I have 3 recommendations based on skill level and general fishing use. I typically don't regard price when it comes to making recommendations, but be aware there are very cheap reels and there are very expensive reels. Majority of the time, I don't think it matters as long as you have a reel that works for you and you know how to use it and you're comfortable with that reel. This is a very cheap baitcaster. I don't recommend this one for anybody. Now, for the beginner, I 100% recommend the Shimano SLX DC, which is the reel right here. And it is paired to a loose carbon fiber SLX DC. Will cost slightly more than a regular Shimano, but the DC function will really help you learn. But you very well could get by with the regular Shimano SLX and just learn just as well. When it comes to DC reels, I always make sure I have at least one with me when I'm fishing. They really come in handy when it's really windy. They also produce the most amazing noise when you cast them. And if you know how to use a baitcaster, then those are probably the only two reasons you'd ever want to pay for the extra cost of a DC. For the angler that knows how to use a baitcaster but hasn't yet perfected its use, then I recommend a Daiwa Tatula. Grab this right here. Really, any model of the Tatula will work, and they are super smooth and easy to use, especially when loaded with floral line, and it will really help you master a baitcaster. This model happens to be the Tatula SVTW, and this is a 6.3, and I have it paired to my custom built rod. It's an MHX blank, so if you're looking to get a rod, send me a message and I can make you one. For those anglers that have no issue with the baitcaster, you probably already have your favorite reels that you like to use, but I'm going to recommend the Shimano Curado series. They're reasonably priced for higher end reels, and they work great for the weekend angler or even for tournaments. I primarily use only Daiwa and Shimano reels. The Shimano that I have here is actually a Curado DC, but I also like to use the Shimano Ks or any of the other versions of the Shimano Curados. I have it paired to a loose TP1X speed stick. But there you have it. Follow this guide, practice, 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 and you'll grasp the hang of a baitcaster in no time. Thanks for watching. Catch you next time.